The thud of paper hitting the table echoed across the sleek boardroom. Rebecca Turner, the powerful CEO, clutched the document with trembling hands, her breath uneven. Around her, executives whispered nervously, unsure of what they had just seen. Then a voice cut through the silence. Not deep, not commanding. High, clear, innocent. "Ma'am, that's my dad's signature." Every head snapped toward the sound. A thin boy with messy blonde hair, no older than 12, stood beside the janitor. His words, simple and pure, carried more weight than any accusation. And in that instant, an empire began to crumble. The air inside the boardroom was heavy, almost suffocating. Rebecca Turner stood tall at the head of the polished table, trying to mask the tremor in her hand as she held the file. The executive sat stiff, eyes darting nervously, waiting for an explanation. Then came the soft scrape of a chair, a sound too out of place in this setting. All eyes turned toward a boy standing beside the janitor. His name was Ethan Hayes, just 12 years old, wearing scuffed sneakers and a faded t-shirt. In his small hands was the very paper Rebecca had slammed down. His bright blue eyes scanned the bottom of the page, and then he lifted his head. With a voice steady yet innocent, he said, "Ma'am, that's my dad's signature." The words struck like lightning, freezing the room into silence. Rebecca blinked rapidly, her voice breaking. What did you say?" she demanded, though it came out weak, fragile. The executives exchanged startled looks, some leaning forward, others whispering in disbelief. A child's voice didn't belong in this room, yet the certainty in Ethan's tone carried more authority than any of their titles. It was the kind of truth no one could brush aside. Beside him, Samuel Hayes, the janitor, stood frozen, his chest tightening. He had never wanted his son involved in this ugly legacy. But Ethan had seen the signature, had recognized it instantly. Samuel placed a rough hand on the boy's shoulder, but didn't stop him. Deep down he knew his silence had lasted too long, and now his son was the one to break it. One executive cleared his throat nervously. "What exactly does the boy mean? Whose signature is that?" Ethan met his eyes with quiet bravery. "My dad's, Robert Hayes." The name dropped like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock across the room. Several people gasped. Rebecca staggered back half a step, as if the ground beneath her feet had cracked open. "No!" Rebecca snapped, her voice shrill, her mask slipping. "This is nonsense! This is not a child's place!" But before she could finish, Ethan interrupted, his young voice cutting sharper than steel. "The truth doesn't care about age." His words hung in the air, so simple, so pure, that not even the most powerful person in the room could challenge them. Samuel lowered his head, tears slipping down his weathered face. He had carried the burden of truth in silence for years, sweeping floors while watching lies build towers. He always thought he would be the one to speak, to finally break the chains. But it wasn't him. It was his son, standing there with innocent courage, saying the words he never could. The room felt different now. It wasn't anger that filled the space. It was truth, raw and undeniable, spoken by a child too young to be corrupted by fear or greed. And in that moment, Rebecca Turner realized she had no defense. Because when the truth comes from a child, there's nowhere left to hide. The boardroom exploded into noise. Executives leaned forward, voices overlapping in disbelief. "A child? What is this nonsense?" one scoffed, though his voice shook. Another whispered urgently, "If what he says is true, everything we know about this company could be a lie." Rebecca slammed her palm against the table, the sharp sound echoing, but even that couldn't drown out the storm. Her face flushed crimson as she glared at Samuel. "Why is he here? Why is a child speaking in my boardroom?" she demanded, her voice trembling between fury and fear. Samuel swallowed hard, guilt pressing down on him. "Because he saw what you tried to hide," he replied quietly. Ethan clutched the paper tighter, his small hand shaking, but his eyes never looked away from Rebecca's. "This is absurd!" Rebecca's voice cracked. "Do you all seriously believe the words of a janitor's son?" But her protest sounded hollow, her authority unraveling with each passing second. The executives shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they could dismiss what had just been said. After all, the boy's eyes held no agenda, no motive, only truth. It was a truth that felt heavier than any corporate report. Samuel finally stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "My father, Robert Hayes, drew those designs. His name is right there. And my son recognized his handwriting before any of you dared to admit it." Gasps rippled through the room again. One woman whispered, "Hayes, wasn't he the mechanic who died all those years ago?" Another nodded grimly, connecting the dots. The silence that followed was suffocating. Rebecca's hands trembled as she grabbed the paper from Ethan, staring at the signature. Memories she had buried long ago rushed back. The night her father locked himself in his study, the stolen sketches, the guilt that gnawed at her teenage heart. She clenched the paper so tightly it crumpled. "No," she whispered to herself, but her voice carried, and everyone heard the weakness in it. Ethan, his small voice cutting through again, asked the question no one else dared. "Why does my grandpa's name say Turner instead of Hayes?" The room froze. His innocence turned the accusation into something undeniable, something too pure to be denied. Rebecca's knees buckled slightly, and for the first time in her career, she looked less like a CEO and more like a woman trapped in the web of her father's lies. One executive leaned forward, his voice grave. "Rebecca, is this true?" All eyes bore into her, the weight of the company pressing down. Rebecca's lips trembled as she searched for words, but silence betrayed her. Her power, her control, her carefully built empire, it all cracked under the stare of a child. And Samuel stood silently beside his son, knowing the storm had only just begun. The room, once filled with corporate pride, now felt like a courtroom. No one spoke. Rebecca's breathing grew ragged as tears welled in her eyes. She wanted to scream, to deny, to fight, but the truth stood before her in the innocent voice of a 12-year-old. And in that moment, she realized there was no escape. Willow Creek, a small American town where picket fences lined the streets and neighbors waved from their porches. On one side of town stood the Turner Mansion, 3 stories high, gleaming white with manicured lawns and a shiny black Cadillac in the driveway. On the other, a modest blue house with peeling paint and an old Chevy truck parked out front. The home of Robert Hayes and his son Samuel. 2 families, 2 worlds, destined to collide. Rebecca Turner grew up under the shadow of her father, Thomas Turner, a man who valued ambition above all else. He wore tailored suits, barked orders, and filled his daughter's mind with one command: power is everything. Rebecca excelled in school, always the top of her class, always the one to impress. She carried her father's pride like a medal, but also his pressure like a chain. Behind the perfect facade, she was just a girl longing for freedom. Meanwhile, Robert Hayes lived a simpler life. A mechanic by trade, he was also a dreamer, spending long nights sketching blueprints at his cluttered garage desk. His hands were calloused, his shirts worn, but his mind was sharp, filled with ideas that could change the world. He didn't chase wealth, he chased purpose. His young son, Samuel, often sat on a stool nearby, watching with wide eyes as his father explained how his inventions might help people one day. At school, Samuel and Rebecca crossed paths. She was the polished honor student, always arriving in her father's sleek car. He was the quiet boy with a worn backpack, walking from the edge of town. They rarely spoke, but there was a silent acknowledgement between them, an unspoken recognition of each other's burdens. Rebecca admired his quiet determination, and Samuel noticed the sadness she hid behind her perfect smile. But the connection between their fathers would decide their fate. Thomas Turner saw in Robert Hayes not just a neighbor, but an opportunity. He listened to Robert's ideas, watched his designs, and recognized genius when he saw it. To Thomas, however, genius was something to be taken, not celebrated. And when Robert died suddenly of a heart attack, Thomas saw his chance. The funeral was small and humble, attended mostly by neighbors who respected Robert's kindness. Samuel, just 17, clutched his father's notebook, fighting back tears. Rebecca stood with her father at the back, her young face pale as she overheard whispers, rumors that Robert had been working on something groundbreaking before his death. She glanced at her father, but his expression was unreadable, cold. Weeks later, Turner Enterprises was born. Practically overnight, Thomas unveiled inventions and blueprints that stunned investors. The company soared, hailed as a story of vision and brilliance. But Samuel, still in mourning, recognized something hauntingly familiar in those designs. The sketches, the handwriting, the concepts, they mirrored his father's work. Yet without proof, his suspicions remained a silent burden. And so life moved on. Rebecca went to college, then returned to inherit her father's empire. Samuel worked odd jobs until he eventually found himself as a janitor at Turner Enterprises, the very building built on his stolen dreams. Each night, as he swept its gleaming floors, the weight of injustice pressed heavier on his shoulders. And little did he know, decades later, it would be his son Ethan's innocent voice that finally shattered the silence. It happened on an ordinary evening. Samuel was finishing his janitorial shift, his son Ethan tagging along as he often did after school. The building was mostly empty, its fluorescent lights humming faintly in the silence. As Samuel polished the glass doors outside the CEO's office, Ethan wandered toward a stack of folders left by the shredding bin. "Dad, can I look?" he asked innocently. Samuel sighed, too tired to argue, and nodded. Ethan crouched down and flipped one of the folders open. Inside were yellow documents, their edges frayed with age. His eyes scanned the page, stopping on a familiar scrawl at the bottom. He froze. His little hand trembled as he whispered, "Dad, this is Grandpa's handwriting." Samuel's mop clattered to the floor as he rushed to his son's side. His heart sank when he saw the name written clearly, Robert Hayes. For a long moment, Samuel couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was spinning. He had always suspected, always believed his father's work had been stolen. But here it was, proof, thrown aside like garbage. Tears blurred his vision as he pressed his hand over Ethan's shoulder. "You shouldn't have to see this," he murmured, but Ethan shook his head firmly. "Grandpa's name deserves to be seen." That night at home, Samuel sat at the kitchen table with his father's old notebook, comparing the sketches to what Ethan had found. The lines matched perfectly. Ethan leaned over the pages, his voice quiet but certain. "Dad, they really stole from Grandpa, didn't they?" Samuel's throat tightened. He had no answer, only a painful silence. But the look in Ethan's eyes told him. His son already knew the truth. The next morning, Rebecca Turner delivered a presentation to the board, her voice confident, her slides glowing on the massive screen. She spoke proudly of her father's vision, pointing to the very designs that bore Robert Hayes's hand. From the back of the room, Samuel pushed his mop slowly, trying to remain invisible. But Ethan, sitting quietly on a bench, clenched his fists as he recognized the same signature again. Ethan tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, that's Grandpa's," he whispered urgently. Samuel shushed him, his heart pounding. He couldn't let the boy speak out, not yet, not here. But Ethan's small face flushed with anger, his innocence colliding with injustice. "Why is she saying it's hers when it's not?" the boy whispered again, his voice shaking. Samuel closed his eyes, ashamed. "Because the world doesn't always care about truth, son." That night, Samuel wrestled with himself. He had carried the burden of silence for decades, but now his son was watching, learning from his every choice. Could he really ask Ethan to swallow the same pain he had? He wanted to protect the boy, but Ethan's insistence, his piercing questions, forced Samuel to confront what he had avoided. His son's innocence was a mirror to his own cowardice. For Samuel, the moment was no longer about revenge. It was about legacy. His father's stolen dreams, his son's growing voice. And for the first time, Samuel realized he might not be the one to reveal the truth. It might be Ethan, the boy too pure to lie, too bold to be silenced, who would force the world to listen. The following days were unbearable. Every time Samuel walked the halls of Turner Enterprises, pushing his mop, Ethan's words echoed in his head. "Grandpa's name deserves to be seen." He avoided Rebecca, avoided the board, but everywhere he turned, he saw his father's stolen legacy hanging on the walls, celebrated as Thomas Turner's brilliance. The lie was everywhere, and now it felt louder than ever. Rebecca, though still projecting confidence, sensed something was shifting. She often caught glimpses of the janitor's boy wandering the halls, his bright eyes fixed on her. The boy's gaze unnerved her more than any investor's demands. It was innocent, but it carried an unspoken accusation. She began to have restless nights, haunted by her father's betrayal and by the growing possibility that truth might surface. One afternoon, Ethan overheard two executives chatting in the lobby. "Turner's story is airtight," one said smugly. "No one will ever know the old mechanic had a hand in this." Ethan's stomach churned, his fists balled. Later, he told his father word for word. Samuel felt his chest tighten with shame and rage. His son was no longer sheltered. He was witnessing the cruelty of the world firsthand. And Samuel could no longer stay silent. Driven by a mix of fear and duty, Samuel snuck into the archives late one night. Ethan followed, flashlight in hand. Together they unearthed dusty boxes filled with contracts, letters, and sketches. And there it was, Robert Hayes's name, crossed out in fading ink, replaced crudely with Thomas Turner. Ethan gasped, holding the page close. "They tried to erase him," he said, his voice shaking with both sorrow and fury. Rebecca walked in on them the next morning. Her heels clicked against the archive floor as she froze at the sight of Samuel and Ethan hunched over the documents. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her tone sharp but tinged with fear. Samuel stood tall for once, his son at his side. "Looking at what belongs to us," he answered firmly. Ethan raised the page toward her, eyes blazing. "Why did your dad erase my grandpa's name?" The confrontation shook Rebecca. She snapped, "You don't understand. This is business." But the words sounded weak, hollow, even to her own ears. Ethan's small voice pierced her defenses. "Business doesn't mean stealing." The boy's words hit harder than any accusation an adult could make. Rebecca's face paled. For the first time in years, she felt her empire slipping out of her control. The tension only grew. Whispers began spreading among employees. Rumors of documents, of the janitor's strange late-night discoveries, of the boy who kept pointing to signatures no one else dared question. The lie that had once been untouchable now trembled under the weight of a child's honesty. Rebecca tried to bury the fear, but it gnawed at her constantly, even in her sleep. Samuel knew the breaking point was near. He had kept silent his whole life, but Ethan refused to. And deep down, Samuel realized something extraordinary. His father had left him courage, and that courage had passed into his son. The world might ignore the janitor, but no one could ignore the voice of a 12-year-old boy telling the truth. The boardroom was packed, the atmosphere tense with expectation. Rebecca Turner stood at the head of the long table, her voice steady as she presented Turner Enterprises' next great expansion. Investors leaned in, pens scratching across notepads, hungry for more promises. At the back of the room, Samuel entered quietly with his son Ethan, both carrying more than just silence. The boy clutched a folder to his chest, his eyes were set on Rebecca. Rebecca's words flowed with practiced ease, but deep inside she trembled. Every time her gaze flicked toward the janitor and his son, her throat tightened. She knew what they carried. She knew what they could destroy. At the back of the room, Ethan opened the folder and laid the paper on the table. The room seemed to stop breathing. At the bottom of the page, the signature glared back at her, Robert Hayes. Ethan's small voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "Ma'am, that's my dad's signature." His words sliced through the room like a blade. Executives froze, their pens hovering midair, eyes wide with disbelief. Rebecca's face drained of color. For years she had feared this moment, but she never imagined it would come from a child too innocent to lie, too pure to be ignored. Gasps filled the air. One executive stammered, "Is this true? Rebecca, answer him." Another leaned closer to the paper, pointing out the faint traces of erased ink, the ghost of a name crossed out. Rebecca staggered, gripping the edge of the table. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered, tears rising. But the boy's gaze didn't soften. "You said it was your father's work, but it was my grandpa's." Samuel stepped forward, his voice breaking after years of silence. "This company, this empire, was built on my father's dreams. Dreams stolen from him the day he died." His words quivered with pain, but Ethan stood taller, clearer. "He's my grandpa," the boy said fiercely, "and you tried to erase him." The board fell silent, the truth undeniable in the trembling paper before them. Rebecca dropped into her chair, her hands covering her face. For decades, she had worn strength like armor, but now the weight of guilt crushed her. "Your father was the genius," she sobbed. "Mine was the thief." The confession spilled from her lips, raw and unpolished, but true. Executives exchanged stunned looks, the empire they trusted unraveling before their eyes. No one spoke. No one dared. The silence was heavier than thunder. And in that silence, Rebecca wept. Not as a CEO, not as a leader, but as a daughter broken by her father's sins. Across from her stood Samuel, tears streaming, and Ethan, his small shoulders squared like a soldier of truth. And in that moment, the hierarchy collapsed. The janitor, his son, and the truth stood taller than the empire itself. Rebecca dropped into her chair, her hands covering her face. For decades, she had worn strength like armor, but now the weight of guilt crushed her. "Your father was the genius," she sobbed. "Mine was the thief." The confession spilled from her lips, raw and unpolished, but true. Executives exchanged stunned looks, the empire they trusted unraveling before their eyes. No one spoke. No one dared. The silence was heavier than thunder. And in that silence, Rebecca wept, not as a CEO, not as a leader, but as a daughter broken by her father's sins. Across from her stood Samuel, tears streaming, and Ethan, his small shoulders squared like a soldier of truth. And in that moment, the hierarchy collapsed. The janitor, his son, and the truth stood taller than the empire itself. The boardroom was no longer a place of power. It was a place of reckoning. Rebecca lifted her tear-stained face, her voice unsteady but sincere. "I can't undo what was done, but I can give your father the honor he deserves." Her words quivered, but they carried more weight than any corporate speech she had ever given. Samuel closed his eyes, releasing a breath he'd been holding for decades. Ethan stepped forward, his voice soft but firm. "I don't care about the company. I just don't want Grandpa's name to be forgotten." The room stilled again, moved by the simplicity of his words. Executives, hardened by years of profit and numbers, felt something they hadn't in years: shame. They looked down at the table, unable to meet the boy's eyes. For the first time, truth felt heavier than wealth. Rebecca nodded slowly, her voice breaking. "Then that's what we'll do. Every record, every speech, every plaque will carry Robert Hayes's name. He will never be erased again." The promise brought fresh tears to Samuel's eyes, and for the first time he allowed himself to weep openly in front of them all. His father's silence had finally found its voice, through his grandson. Weeks later, Turner Enterprises unveiled a bronze plaque in front of their headquarters. The inscription read, "In honor of Robert Hayes, whose vision built the dream." Cameras flashed, reporters crowded, and the story swept the nation. But for Samuel, standing beside his son, none of that mattered. What mattered was the name etched in metal, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten. Ethan reached up, brushing his fingers over the letters. "He's really here now, Dad," he whispered. Samuel placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice breaking. "Yes, son, and he always will be." In that moment, generations of silence ended, replaced by pride and peace. Robert Hayes had finally been given the recognition he deserved. Rebecca stood at a distance, watching with tears in her eyes. For once, she felt no need to stand in the spotlight. She had chosen the harder path: truth over lies, humility over pride. And though her empire was shaken, she knew it now stood on something real: honesty. She whispered to herself, "Maybe now I can finally breathe." The story spread far beyond Willow Creek. People whispered not of wealth or scandal, but of a janitor, a boy, and a stolen legacy finally returned. Families across America saw themselves in it: the struggle for truth, the burden of silence, the courage of innocence. And many learned a lesson that day, that even the smallest voice can speak the loudest truth. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with someone you love, because sometimes it takes a child's voice to remind us that truth cannot be buried forever.